Good evening, everybody. My name's Zoe and I work in the public programs team here at ACMI. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge those from other nations who may be present here tonight. Welcome everyone to Studio One. Tonight's conversation, Moving Cities and Changing Communities. Tonight's conversation will be streamed live, and we will have some time at the end if you'd like to ask any questions, and we'll come around with some microphones so the people watching the stream can hear your lovely questions. And without further ado, will you please give a warm welcome to our ACMI Assistant Curator, Chelsey O'Brien.
My name's Chelsey O'Brien and I was the lead curator on Zanny Begg's The Beehive. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we are gathered. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to the elders from other communities who may be here today. Now it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome such a special panel here this evening. We are of course joined by Zanny Begg, artist of The Beehive, but also Timmah Ball and Jessie Scott. It's such a privilege to have these three here this evening. We're of course going to be talking about gentrification and what happens to cities when they change. You know, what happens, what's the human cost of development? This conversation has really grown out of Zanny Begg's The Beehive, where she explores the unsolved murder and life of Aiden Nielsen, who went missing in 1975. The Beehive explores notions of gentrification, of right to the city, of sexual liberation and freedom at a time where gangsters kind of really ruled King's Cross in Sydney. And all of those kind of really big, weighty topics are really brought to the front. But where Zanny really compares what happened in 1975 to the notions of what's happening to Sydney and, in fact, cities all around the world today. And that's one of the things that we're really hoping to pull apart and explore in tonight's conversation. So I thought we'd start the evening with playing the trailer for The Beehive. I know that we actually opened it a little bit later tonight, so hopefully everybody got the opportunity to see it before tonight's conversation. But if you haven't, this will give you a little bit of a taste. So if we could play the trailer. Is that me or you? Perfect, thank you.
Sometimes it would just bubble up in conversation. I'd just sit there and listen. I was like, who's this? And they'd explain the whole story to me. And then they'd argue amongst themselves about what they thought had happened. Bonnie was like, yeah, I remember she worked at Lagos and she remembered going out on stage the night that they all thought Juanita's body was under the stage.
Hello, this is the office of Now.
Hi, Juanita. I'm calling to set up a meeting with Eddie Trigg. The Carousel Club would like to take out a half-page ad in the next issue.
Great. I'll see you tomorrow at 10.
And then one of the other girls was, no. She was taken to the gazebo and they chopped her up and put her down the incinerator. And then there was like, no, she's buried under the airport. And no, she's buried under the development over there in Victoria Street. It was always very passionate and people were very upset to not know what happened.
Wow. Pretty powerful, hey? So Aiden Nielsen was, of course, this incredible woman. She was an heiress. She was this extremely funky kind of style icon, but she was also an activist. She was a newspaper publisher and she was a rebel, and she really fought for the people of her community to save King's Cross and Potts Point and Woolloomooloo at the time in 1975. And the work itself deals with many issues. And so at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Zanny to talk a little bit more about the work with its 1,344 different variants, because of course the work operates on an algorithm, so every version of the work is slightly different, revealing and kind of examining different aspects of Juanita's life and death.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. I guess when I started the project, I thought what was the story was her death, and that we didn't really know what happened to her. And, you know, living in Sydney since 2000, it's part of the urban landscape is just that kind of aching, wondering, you know, what happened to Juanita. And there'll be people who are a bit older who knew her or had stories or, you know, that sort of thing. So when I pitched to do this project to ACMI, and, I was interested because it was a cold case to use the randomisation as a way of kind of driving the ambiguity of what happened to her. But the more I read about her, and the deeper I got into the sort of research preparing for the film, I really shifted my emphasis, and it became back onto her and who she was. So obviously you can't separate her death from who she was, but for me the project and the kind of what really drove it for me was not the gangsters and those last moments and the kind of what happened at Les Girls, important though that is and unresolved though that is. It was really that there was this incredible woman, you know, and she was an activist who was so effective in her campaign against overdevelopment of King's Cross and against gentrification. Not that they would have really used that term the way we do back in the 70s, but effectively that's what she was fighting around. That a bunch of people wanted to kill her, that she was so effective and she was, in her own way, really uniquely challenging to the developers. It was like a cat and mouse game. They'd bought up all the houses along Victoria Street where she lived and then left them empty because they were very beautiful. It was, Victoria Street was considered the Montmartre of Sydney. Not that we really need to compare it to Paris, of all places, but anyway, that was the comparison of the day. And they were left them all empty because they wanted to degrade them, sort of like a dereliction by neglect. But people had squatted them, so it was a real cat and mouse about what was going to happen to these buildings. And they all played their cards, and it seemed that Juanita always had one extra card to play right down to the end, and that was, I guess, why she was so threatening. We can get into that a bit later, but that's sort of an introduction. So the randomisation, really, what's new in each sitting, I hope, for the audience, is that you find out more about her. Obviously, there's clues to what her death and who did it, and I think certainly my opinion of who killed her is totally in the film, but I'm hoping what audiences are discovering is just a little bit more about her and kind of what she stood for and how rebellious she was and how interesting she was as a character.
It's like, I'm a big fan of the work, full disclosure. One of the amazing sections, which I think you've put together for this evening, is where the film talks about gentrification and really examines that kind of, that what happened at the time, but also brings this really contemporary message or story, and you really unpack that really well. So do you want to play that clip now?
Sure, let's get into it.
What happened through the Green Band movement and around Victoria Street in particular was we started to think about who owned the city. I'm Ian Millis. I was a squatter in Victoria Street and one of the people involved in the Victoria Street Resident Action Group. I met Juanita because she was operating the newspaper Now, which was basically the voice of King's Cross at that time.
I am part of Fairfield, so I work very extensively with the sort of Cabramatta, Canley Vale sort of regions, even Carramar as well. So all these different areas which are often seen as the sort of ethnic ghettos. I always wanted to make a community project resonate internationally. Hence, that was the reason why I did projects which are of the martial arts action genre, worked overseas, worked with Jackie Chan, then I came back. There is a commonality between me and Juanita. We weren't born to be fighters or warriors. We kind of were in this situation where we see injustice and we eventually make a decision whether to sort of be silent or whether to actually stand up and say something about it.
We knew we were dealing with really scary people, but we still were, I think, really all quite shocked at the extent to which it degenerated into such extreme violence. That was Timmah's approach to things. It was a conscious tactic to basically blitz the street with sheer aggression and very quickly move all the tenants before there could actually be any resistance to the development. Miser was a very recognisable character because of his big black moustache. He was a karate champion, you know, there's endless photos of him dressed up in his karate gear, and so he was really quite a professional sort of thug. They smashed up as much of the buildings as they could, you know, and that in itself was an intimidation tactic. You know, they'd go in and smash up kitchens and bathrooms and all the facilities inside them. So they'd make the houses as close to uninhabitable as they possibly could. We had this group of people who basically set out to intimidate everyone and drive them out. And within a couple of weeks, they pretty much managed that. I mean, they turned up telling people they had to move out. Many of these people were protected tenants, which you had in those days, but basically they just scared the daylights out of them. And it was like really being in a war zone. I mean, we effectively occupied this area, but then we were ringed by these bunch of thugs who also patrolled the street to keep an eye on us. And then behind them was the police, you know, who were definitely not on our side.
I'm also trained in karate. When I heard about Joe Meisner, I want to go back in time and kick his ass.
Right from the start, the issue was gentrification.
Gentrification is the cleansing of low-income areas, mostly to conform to middle-class expectations.
The community that had been there was a very mixed community. I mean, it ranged from people who were quite wealthy to people who were really quite poor. And gentrification removed that. You know, gentrification basically was a sort of monoculture of middle class to upper class people. And that was very much the aim of the developer.
Woolloomooloo was not the suburb that you would ever go to. And then looking now at the waterfront and what's happened to down there, it's Maserati Central.
There's become a real focus on real estate as a form of wealth generation and investment, and so a whole bunch of economic changes have moved it just beyond a simple process of say richer people moving into an area. It's become much more sinister, and it's become a real driver of inequality.
I think with Western Sydney, even back when my parents came here to Australia, I mean, there was thousands that left war-torn Vietnam. So when they came to Australia, they were sort of put in hostels and places, and they go, okay, there you go.
I mean, we wrote songs at the time which were about, you know, being driven out to the western suburbs, because in the western suburbs there were no facilities. It was housing commission, there was no facilities, and that was what happened to people. They were basically forced out of these places and dumped out there. And
now living in Fairfield, seeing like now there's a large intake of, you know, Iraqi, Syrian migrants coming over, and again, 8,000's relocated in Sydney, yet, okay, where they're going to stay, how they're going to survive, where's the support system for them to really have, you know, the opportunity to actually settle in Australia.
The whole resident action group movement, you know, was often presented as a thing about heritage, you know, because the middle class could sort of swallow that, you know, but in actual fact, it was about a fight over ownership of the city.
Amazing. So, okay, In 1975, the Green Band movement was a hugely powerful movement and pretty amazing. You know, we've got a group of community group working with unions to stop development. It's a pretty big ask, and actually Juanita really took the reins of that and influenced the green bands when Frank Timmah really thought he'd stifled all of her efforts. Can you talk a little bit more about specifically the green bands and how you think that influenced the story at the time, but then also what do you think Juanita has saved in her mission?
Well, you've reminded me that I probably gave a slightly skewed perspective just commenting before, because, I mean, Juanita was a really amazing activist, but she was also active in an amazing time. You know, I mean, individuals can't really alone change things. They need to be in social movements and working together. And what was really unique about the time that Juanita was active was the Green Bands movement, which, you know, it would be wonderful to see something like that again, and I guess that's what, you know, people involved in these issues think about a lot, is how that could happen. But I mean, what you had was basically an alliance between the labourers on the site who were building the developments, the local communities, and, you know, environmental movements, queer movements, feminist movements, you know, all sorts of social movements, who for a moment there in Sydney, and this was a building boom, we're thinking about the 70s when the whole skyline of Sydney was changing really rapidly and there was buildings going up everywhere and lots of money to be made. They kind of coalesced, and for a moment it was like they held the reins of the city, and they actually gave this sense of like popular participatory planning to social movements and to communities and to residents, you know. And so Juanita was really able to lean on that, you know. She was able to tap into that and to connect her disquiet about what's happening in her own street to this really, really vibrant, strong social movement. And to put that into monetary figures, someone like Frank Timmah, who owned most of Victoria Street and wanted to build a development which in the end went mostly ahead, although impacted by the campaign, was losing $3,000 a day, which would be billions today. I mean, that was in the 70s. So he was bleeding, he was hemorrhaging money because, you know, he thought he could just get in there and make a quick dollar and didn't underestimate it, I guess, the social opposition that he would run into. What did they actually save? Well, one thing that the Green Bands absolutely saved was Woolloomooloo. So, you know, the area around Art Space, as, you know, an arts community, you might have been there, is Housing Commission, and it still is to this day. Certainly Cirrus Building and Millers Point and Glebe and, you know, some of the other public housing in Sydney was not directly in response to the campaign around Victoria Street, but was indirectly a climate of that time that those sort of public housing was built. And really the demand was that working class people or poor people or people on fixed incomes or low income people have a right to live in the inner city. And somewhere like Woolloomooloo is right on the harbour, you know, and Millers Point as well. And, you know, King's Cross obviously looks down and has magnificent harbour views. And the developers hated that because they're like, poor people don't deserve those harbour views. You know, that real estate is too costly. And so now we know that Cirrus is, you know, under threat. Millers Point has been sold. And the fear is that Woolloomooloo may be next, you know, and that is a very vibrant working class community that's still in the heart of Sydney. King's Cross itself, well, they saved the buildings and that makes it very beautiful as a neighbourhood, but it was really the community that the fight was about, and I think you'd have to say that Potts Point, King's Cross is still it's a pretty gentrified area, and I don't think it has the diversity that existed in the 70s. And that whole sort of, see, it wasn't just Juanita and the unions, it was like Les Girls was a trans club, and there were lots of trans performers who were finding a space for themselves in Sydney to perform and create an audience and create a sort of atmosphere and a vibe. There was a lot of sex workers, bohemians, nonconformists, you know, artists, people who didn't really want to fit into that sort of consumerist cultural kind of trajectory. I mean, one of the little not little, but like the side stories that I wanted to tell more of, but is sort of really related to the Juanita thing, was also the story of Esther, who was an Aboriginal woman who was squatting in a building, who also died shortly before Juanita did. And it took a long time to even find her name. She isn't named, and that's sort of part of the story, is sort of this attention on Juanita, but there is, another woman who died who hasn't had that same attention. So, sort of looking at kind of the reasons why that might be the case and giving her a name. And, my job was to tell the story of Juanita, but I wanted Esther's story to be in there a little bit as well, to talk about some of the loss of that diversity in that community was economic, cultural, it manifested in lots of different ways. So, but yeah, I mean, it was a big fight and there were big victories, but obviously there were some great losses, and Juanita's life was one of them.
We might move on to the next presentation, but I am very excited to pick this up again when we have some questions at the end. Timmah, I'm going to pass you.
So I think, touching on from where you left off, I've been really interested in my practice as an urban planner, and probably thinking about it a little bit more through writing, is in, I guess, this really strong rhetoric around gentrification. Why are Aboriginal voices so often absent or forgotten? So this year in particular, I wrote a piece for Meanjin called Whose Land Is It Anyway?, which really looked at kind of the rise of, I guess, white artists really dominating conversations around gentrification, and more about sort of the issue of the right to the city and sort of who owns the city, and that kind of narrative of, I really love Fitzroy and Collingwood, but I'm really devastated because now I have to live in Reservoir. And I guess from an Indigenous perspective, it's almost laughable, because you're sort of thinking about like 60,000 years of history, and then the impact of intergenerational trauma in the last 250 years, and that sort of sense of that inability, that sort of, which I guess sort of you would argue comes back from Terra Nullius, sort of this idea of the ability to be entitled and claim space so easily. And I've also been thinking, is that somehow to do, I think a lot of reasons why there aren't more Aboriginal voices, artists, writers thinking about gentrification or being involved in that activism is mainly because there are so many deeper issues to contend with, and for a lot of people it is about land rights and looking about reparation, getting back onto country, even thinking about what's been going on recently with Vic Roads, with the removal of sacred scar trees. And yeah, I think there's something to sort of say about that. But I think this is some work from Linda Kennedy, who's a UN architect, who spent some time studying in Melbourne. That's how I met her. And she really sort of talks about sort of, I guess, the irony of the built environment and living in cities, particularly for contemporary Indigenous practitioners who, like her, is an architect, or myself, and sort of what the city means to us. I think it's such a contested space that you're trying to sort of work out how you can incorporate and maintain practice at the expense of the fact that what has been lost, and also at the obvious expense of the fact that you probably can't afford to live in certain suburbs of the city. And I think it's sort of really interesting to kind of, I guess, look at the irony of the fact that probably a lot of the people who are talking about, or who really talk about the impact of gentrification, are people who probably have the mobility and capacity to find housing somewhere else. And I think what I find really interesting is the kind of sense that to have an arts practice, you need to be in a certain location. I think a lot of Indigenous artists I know and refugee artists are living all over Victoria, and definitely sort of areas sort of like Point Cook, Wyndham, those really outer urban fringe areas. People like Hayley, Millie Barker, Tanya Kness, who's a refugee, El Salvadorian woman, they've got incredible practices, and it's sort of not particularly concerning for them to live in inner city suburbs. And yet you're sort of reading pieces by Fiona Wright, Roni Doyle, really talking about this incredible hardship of the moment when it got too expensive to afford Collingwood and then having to move to Preston. And I kind of, in some other work I'm doing at the moment, I've sort of been really interrogating Courtney Barnett and the song D Preston. And it's just so funny because Preston is a great place. It's not depressing to live there. Obviously, I'd assume, Courtney probably afford a house quite easily there now. And, good on her. I'm not in any way critiquing her personally. I think she's really fantastic. But it's just really interesting how, I guess, from a white settler perspective, it's a depressing narrative. Like, thinking that you have to move 2 suburbs down is depressing, but it's sort of not from a kind of Indigenous perspective, and certainly not from when you're thinking about a global refugee crisis and being 10 years in a Sudanese refugee camp and then finally getting to Melbourne or Sydney. Those sorts of journeys are so monumentously, incomprehensible for me to sort of really think about. That, I don't know, I just sort of think it's interesting that we kind of we can be really concerned about moving a few suburbs on. I think thinking more broadly about housing affordability, which I can sort of touch on from an urban planning perspective later, is so important, and the right for every human to have. Housing is a fundamental human right, so ensuring that in a country like Australia we can't provide housing for absolutely everybody is astonishing, and it's just a problem that we have to absolutely address. And I'm also just been thinking a lot, I think one of the big things about gentrification and why obviously artists feel very compelled to talk about it is because a lot of the time it's that cycle of artists are the ones that gentrify. Like, the positive aspect of gentrification is like they move to a suburb because it's low income and they can afford rent. They bring the artist-run galleries, the cafes, they place make it, they make it beautiful, attractive. Then all the lawyers want to come in, and then the people who made it amazing can't afford to live there. And it's a horrible sort of cycle. But again, I think it's something that, I don't know, you sort of forget that sort of really fundamental displacement of First Nations people. And for me, what really struck me is a curator, Kim Kruger, who was friends with, actually related to the late Lisa Belair, who was an amazing poet and activist from Stradbroke Island, but was based in Melbourne. And she did an incredibly amazing book of poetry, Dreaming in Urban Areas, as well as heaps of other activism. And just recently, unfortunately, she passed away quite a while ago, but Kim was telling me that they're sort of using her image in marketing for these very expensive little Oxford Collingwood apartments. And yeah, it's just this like really painful irony that Aboriginal people, because there is suddenly this interest in Aboriginal art and culture, that the people who, could never afford to live in these suburbs, whose, land and culture was taken from, are now ironically being used in marketing. And yeah, I think it's just a really quite strange, ironic cycle, which is sort of why I kind of wanted to use what Linda's been discussing. And I just think, I don't know, I'm really interested in housing and access to the city, but kind of how I guess the conversation can move probably in a way more into sort of broader housing and homelessness policies and agenda. And not sure how we're going with time, but I did a recent interview with Mojo Juju for The Big Issue. And again, some of the really interesting things she was saying, because obviously gentrification hugely affects music and music venues, who are often the first to be kicked out when these exorbitantly, unfortunately expensive, ugly apartments go up everywhere. But even, I mean, certainly from their perspective, they were really talking about just this insane, abject rise of homelessness that is everywhere. And yeah, again, for them sort of like living sort of further out north hasn't been an issue. It's just, yeah, I guess sort of been a real privilege, and they've been able to obviously have this amazing career as a musician and haven't, sort of really felt, how they put it, like they've never really felt entitled to Fitzroy, particularly because they're Wiradjuri and not Koori. And I guess for most Aboriginal people, definitely myself, like, you know, you want to sort of prioritise Koori people. And yeah, you sort of think of what Fitzroy has meant for people to sort of, really reconnect and find sort of family connections, and how great it would be if a lot of these suburbs were prioritised for affordable housing for those communities. Yeah. And that's about it.
No, I was just going to say that's such a obvious and kind of obviously insightful comment. You know, why aren't we prioritising housing for people and community who have been there for longer than anywhere else? And it seems like such a lack in town planning and a lack of nurturing of the city space, first and foremost. Shall we move on to Jessie?
Okay. Oh, okay, there we go. Yeah. So I have so many slides, and so many things to say. So I'm just going to try and calm down, and we'll go through them one by one. I just want to go through a couple of projects that I've done over the last 7 years. This is one of the first projects that I did ostensibly about gentrification. I did a six-month residency at a small arts centre in Footscray that was in an old pub that had been turned into an apartment block with some portion of social housing. And there was a lentil as anything on the bottom floor and this little Barclay Arts Centre above it. And for 6 months, I'd go there every week and work with members of the community to essentially produce a street photography exhibition. But at the same time, I was kind of wandering around Footscray every day, somewhere that I'd been going since I was a child, and just noticing for the first time the vulnerability of some of these sites that had always seemed to me to be eternal and constant. And Olympic Donuts was one of them that I became a bit obsessed with. There was a new train station being built next to it that just totally overshadowed it, and it just seemed so small and fragile and vulnerable. And so I made this video work where it was 10 sites around Footscray, including Forges of Footscray, the great old Western Suburbs shopping centre, and basically kind of had them merging into each other over a period of time, each of these pairs of sites. And I was kind of looking at the idea that these changes happen so slowly and so gradually that you don't notice something's gone until all of a sudden it hits a tipping point and then disappears. I then sort of turned my eye to my own hometown, which was Moonee Ponds, is where I grew up. And this site, which is the old site of the Moonee Ponds Market, you can see the coal centre that's been built across the road, the horrible concrete kind of, big box construction. The Moonee Ponds Market was a very daggy suburban market, very like Preston Market, but it was a hub of the community. It's for as long as I could remember as a child, that was like a weekly trip to the market to go to the deli, go to the butcher, go to the little Jewel supermarket and buy fresh fruit and veggies. Sometime in the 90s, the site got sold. They only semi-demolished it, so for 15 years it sat in kind of development no man's land where they couldn't agree on how to develop the site. It had this temporary fencing around it. It was used as a car park for a while, but all these traces of the original market was still there. And it was really it was really wounding, I think. Every time I walked past it, I felt really upset because it was this place that hadn't actually been erased. like nothing new had been put there. It was just this kind of corpse. And yeah, so I made this 3-channel video installation that examined the site, and the idea behind that was trying to force people to look at things that they'd stopped seeing. There was a real kind of, I think people in the community had stopped seeing it essentially because they'd tried and failed to save it. And then I moved to Coburg in 2011 after having lived in the inner city. And Coburg became kind of my obsession. I've been making work about Coburg since then. Initially, I started making work about Coburg because I got a dog, and all of a sudden I had to walk around Coburg on foot twice a day, every day. And then I had a baby, and again I was pounding the pavement with my baby and noticing the fine-grained details of the environment that I think you don't notice unless you walk through it. And I became a little bit, obsessed with I sort of started amassing this typology of vernacular housing and various aspects of the built environment that I'd never really noticed before. One of my first obsessions was the phenomenon of the weatherboard house that has brick cladding on it. So this is sort of like a real northwestern suburbs phenomenon, and a sort of object of ridicule, at various points in history, tinged with a bit of racism because it was often European migrants who did this. And I just started wondering, why would you do that? Why would you put obviously fake brick on an obviously weatherboard house? And that question sort of led to this, revelations about, our social history, people who come from the Mediterranean. For them, it is shameful to live in a weatherboard house, their values about the built environment are completely different to in Australia. And so to even have fake brick was better than having weatherboard, which for them would have seemed vulnerable and flimsy. So this kind of revelation, pointed me to a whole lot of other questions about the built environment and what it can tell us about a place, what traces people leave behind, especially in the suburbs, which, for architects is not a particularly interesting place because most houses are not architecturally designed, but it's the only architecture that you as an individual can affect, can change, can adapt and put your mark on. Usually we're, very much subjected to architecture. So I kind of became really interested in amassing this sort of typology, again, of, vernacular architecture, adaptive reuse, the way that people have kind of taken something and changed it for their own values or, that represented some social history in the area. I've made videos, photographic exhibitions. One of the other things I was really interested in for a while was shop fronts and how, why were these shops stranded in the middle of these east-west streets that run through the city of Moreland? Speaking to a time when people didn't have cars and so shops had to be more evenly distributed throughout the neighbourhood. I just started thinking that, the built environment is imprinted with these traces of former lives and that it could be read. These traces could be read. And where are we? So another exhibition I did after that was multi-dwelling at Bus Projects. This was a collaboration with an architect, Zoe Diaco-Labrianos, who also lives in Coburg. And basically we were looking at, in this real estate boom where people were not renovating houses, they were not renovating shop fronts anymore because the land was too expensive and too valuable. Small developers were coming in. What was replacing these places that people used to do up or adapt in some way? And what we found was that what they were replacing them with was really shoddily built multi-dwelling townhouses. This project was about kind of looking at that new housing and the question we wanted to answer was, could this new type of cheap housing, which replaced the old type of cheap housing, was it sort of strong enough to to accrete that social and historical information over time? Like, could people actually affect it in the same way that the old housing was able to be adapted over time? A lot of these places are like this accumulation of veneers that represent various, values of home. So you'll have a little bit of fake brick, a bit of fake weatherboard, and it's just kind of wrapped around this, very abstract collage of rooms. That was one of the source images from that sculpture that we made, and it's just an example of like what doesn't happen anymore. People don't renovate, don't do the whole DIY thing anymore, because you can sell the land and make much more from it. So after making work about Coburg, I also had or have an Instagram account that has sort of run alongside this project, where I regularly post images that I'm taking of Coburg along with my own commentaries, but it also engaged with a whole lot of different people about all of these issues: gentrification, heritage, architecture, design, planning. A lot of residents of Coburg kind of like engage and tell their stories about places that I've photographed, in the comments of that account. And so coming to the end of this kind of like cycle of work, I decided to make a book, because I wanted to be able to not just sort of summarise all the images I'd taken, but engage those other perspectives of the same issue that came from all these experts from different areas that I don't have expertise in, and also engage writers to interpret the images from different perspectives. So Timmah was one of those writers. So the book has got some of my images, but also these essays that are from, one's fiction, one's poetry, one's like a typical art essay. There's an experimental piece, just trying to kind of give it different entry points to the images that I've taken. After all this work and, all these kind of photographs of Coburg and all these different projects, I guess some of my reflections on, the issues that we're talking about, I think although gentrification is part of what I'm interested in, it's sort of coming out of the fact that I have an interest in the tension between people and the buildings that they inhabit and build. So for me, gentrification falls out of that, because it accelerates the kind of natural shifts and changes that would happen in the built environment to the point where people start to notice it. But I really think that by the time the average person notices it, it's way too late and the horse has already bolted. An example of this, I think, is the campaign to save Sirius, this amazing, commission housing apartment block that, looks over Sydney Harbour. I think the first time that I heard about Sirius, the first time I read an article about it or, was seeing something about it on social media, get to the bottom of the report and it's like 85% of the people in that block had already been moved on to other housing. So like the community and its links to the building had already been irreparably damaged by the time people were starting to get worked up about saving it. But when it was just commission housing people being pushed around, no one knew about it, no one cared. When it was about, saving this brutalist masterpiece, that's when people started getting, the middle class started getting animated about it. And going back to Footscray, when I was working with people in Footscray, I keep seeing all these urgent panels about gentrification in Footscray lately, in arts organisations. And, when I was doing my residency there 7 years ago now, I was working with people who were under housing pressure, who were being moved further and further into the western suburbs, away from their kinship networks, away from their support networks, away from their friends, away from their workplaces. And so to me, like, that's actually the start of gentrification. That's actually when it starts, that's the first sign. But it's invisible to a lot of people who are not engaged with that segment of the community, I guess. It's a form of slum clearance. And it's very insidious. So it's sort of like the council knows the value of the land and and they want it to be available to developers. But on that depressing note, not all change is bad, okay? So I'm of the opinion that, you know, the push and pull between people in the cities they live in, which was explored by people like Jane Jacobs, is interesting and complex. And I tend to fall down on the side of Jane Jacobs in saying that I think that people are more important in cities than buildings, just a little bit more important, because you know, people can take any space and activate it and make it interesting, and it's not so much the building per se which creates that. However, when you look at this diagram, is from How Buildings Learn, which is a really amazing book by Stuart Brand, who was the author of the Whole Earth catalogue. People might know him from. This is an image of New York City, a representation of every building on the west side of Lower Broadway in New York. And I don't know if you can tell that well in this scan, but some of them are faded out, and those buildings are all the ones that were demolished by 1990. So these are all amazing kind of Victorian era buildings, and there's only 33 left by 1990. And when I first saw this, I was like sort of looking through them all and thinking, far out, these buildings are amazing. I can't believe that, you know, they've lost so much heritage. But then you realise, well, what replaced them was all those amazing Art Deco apartment blocks and amazing Art Deco skyscrapers in the 20s. So, you know, that's what New York is known for. That's, you know, that has become a new heritage unto itself. So you do actually have to allow things to be lost, for new things to be built and new histories to be written. So for me, it's not so much about buildings themselves as like the interaction between people and buildings. And this final image, one of my biggest inspirations, is the French photographer Eugene Atget, who was basically just like an obsessive street photographer who invented basically every genre of street photography you can possibly imagine at a time when the camera had only just been kind of invented itself. And this is an image that he took in Paris, the late 1800s. And basically what he was doing was what every street photographer has been doing ever since, and what, you know, the thousands of us are doing on Instagram all the time, is basically documenting change. So he was documenting the loss of these kind of, this dingy, you know, hand-hewn medieval city of Paris, which was dark and old and, you know, very different to what was emerging at the time, which was the city of light that we know now. So, yeah, I just kind of think if we try to save every historical building, there would be no room for anything to come after it. So, yeah, I'm kind of interested in that idea as well. There you go.
Thank you so much. You've all raised some really amazing points, but certainly, Jessie, that point about the fact that it's not so much about the buildings, but it's about the community, you've all spoken about very eloquently. And I guess I just wanted to ask, and I'm going to kind of address all of these questions to all of you, so just feel free to jump in. What do you think, I mean, apart from, with the loss of community and with the moving out of community, what effect does that have on the city? What does the city, what's left? I know we're talking about, well, there might be a new building that could inspire, but in the gap between when the new building's there, what happens to the city, and what is the cost on the city when communities are moved on?
I think that almost in a way that's the wrong way to think about it, because it's not, like, we shouldn't think about it as like, poor people live here to make the place interesting for us. Like, I think it's actually what happens to those communities. What happens to those people? Where do they go? Like, where do they end up? They end up somewhere. They end up, you know, distant and far from, you know, like their job opportunities or their families, or, you know. So to me, it's like that perspective of the issue is problematic. Yeah.
There's quote from Engels that I wanted to put in the film, but somehow it just kept falling out of the script. But it seemed to sort of address some of those things. But it was a debate, I think, about what was happening to Paris when they were destroying all the dark alleyways and creating the City of Light. And he said the bourgeoisie has only one solution to the housing problem. It's a solution that recreates the problem. And I think that is sort of what we're seeing. And, for me, gentrification, it's not so much specifically about the inner city. I mean, when I started the research for the Beehive project, I was living in Fairfield in Western Sydney, and it's connected. Like you push something one way and it pops out somewhere else. I mean, these are sort of connected systems. But I think what we're seeing is that the cities used to be places of production. So working class communities would live in cities and work in them. So like in Sydney, I know better than Melbourne. But you had the Everleigh rail yards, and you had Marrickville, which was full of factories, still is to a certain extent. You had King's Cross, which had all the wharfies, and these were places who worked on the harbour, and they were sites of production. And what is shifting is that they're turning into sites of consumption, and that is a homogenising thing that I think does actually. It's not creating cities of light, or it's not making space for new, because consumption is something that is. It's sort of foreclosed. I feel it's already predetermined what it's about, whereas when people go into a space and start making culture or building community or opening restaurants or whatever, it's not really foreclosed. It's open, and what happens is, who knows. But I think when it's being about, the inner city becomes this really tightly sort of managed place of consumption, that it is a bit foreclosed, and that is a loss, I feel, and not a loss that's felt evenly. Obviously, I think Timmah's points are really relevant here, that it's not felt evenly. Like some people feel the pinch of that a lot harder than others, and there's definitely privilege that still operates within that. But I think overall, what we're seeing is something that's sort of sad for our cities.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's. I think the interesting thing is, it's problematic because there's so many identities that are raised. Like, it's just so appalling. I was sort of speaking to my partner and a friend who did an event for Melbourne Writers Festival, and they were talking about how there was still just so many people who were just like, oh, I didn't know Aboriginal people lived in cities. And they were both kind of like, oh my God, we really have to start from the base being this low. And so, I think cities are still just such, when you think about cities and communities, they're still just so contested. And I guess that kind of settler narrative is still so explicitly imposed on our understanding of cities. Whereas I think, I don't know, I think sometimes within those sort of struggles, really incredible things are happening, definitely in terms of sort of my experience of working in outer suburban councils like Wyndham and Greater Dandenong, sort of people do feel really disconnected from the inner city. But one positive of that is that some really incredible communities are flourishing on the fringes, kind of with nothing, and which is horrible in some ways. But I think that kind of adaptability of particularly sort of Aboriginal communities, you also see in sort of refugee, migrant communities, is something that we should still celebrate as well. But I think it's sort of probably sort of what Jessie was saying is, I don't know, I think we sort of have to think about it, that cycle, a little bit differently. And I think, I don't know, cities, the reality is Melbourne is, and Sydney, they're going to become really hostile quite quickly. We're sort of not going into the huge gravitas of climate change, but I don't know, it's going to get probably challenging on so many levels really rapidly, and that ability to adapt and sort of find new ways of living is going to be so important.
I think one of the reasons why artists have had this, one of the reasons that artists have had this sort of, you know, huge kind of shock they can't seem to get over, we can't seem to get over, of not being able to live in the inner city anymore, is I think artists have been led to believe falsely that, you know, they're like the first phase of gentrification, that they're somehow this magic bacteria that like creates culture, and they want to be rewarded for it with access to the places that they created. But actually, I think artists are just as exploited in the whole process, and artists moving into a suburb is not the start of gentrification. Like, the start of gentrification happens like way down the line between developers and governments, and, you know, like really boring, ineffable legal stuff that happens around tax and tax write-offs, and, you know, like it's actually deliberate. It's concerted. It's not something that happens accidentally. Sorry, I keep tapping that, but yeah. So I think that artists are actually exploited in the process and don't realise it, and feel like they should be rewarded for adding value to your property. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. There's because that's the whole sort of Rosalind Deutsch sort of argument that, you know, in that book Eviction, that artists move into lower income areas and, you know, the developers follow and blah blah. You know, it seemed really true when she was writing it, and I certainly, you know, I worked on a project in Redfern with Keeg D'Souza called There Goes the Neighbourhood in Redfern, and, you know, we were really influenced by those sort of ideas. Skip forward to now, I think actually what artists are a minor player in what is a real shift in how cities are being thought of, and that it used to be that you know, middle class or wealthier people wanted to live on the estates in the rural areas or in the sort of outer areas where they would have the sort of those big estates or whatever, and now inner city living. And I don't think it's just because of artists. I think it's because of like convenience and jobs and infrastructure and transport and all sorts of other reasons. It's very attractive to wealthy people. And what I was saying about these places becoming, you know, very turned into like sort of cafes and cultural precincts and places of consumption, you know, that's a big thing that artists, I think, are small players in. Not to say we're not important, and our ethics and our choices are absolutely vital, but I don't really think anymore that we're the cause. You know, I think that we are more a symptom of this broader issue.
Yeah, one of the things, so Zanny, I know that you referenced Peter Reeves' book a lot in the making of the Beehive. One of the things that he speaks about quite early on is the fact that in the late 60s, a lot of the zoning laws changed around Sydney, which is why you got that huge boom in the 70s where the skyline completely changed. What is the role of governments and local governments, and what can we do to turn things around or influence now? You know, we don't have the green bab movements. What can we kind of, and should we be fighting against it, or is it something that we need to change our thinking on and try to work with more?
Turn to our planner.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's so much going on. There's sort of the inclusionary zoning movement. So there's about sort of 5 sites where they're just sort of trying to prioritise sort of social affordable housing. You've got the sort of strategies like Homes for Victorians, which are really looking at sort of, I guess, protecting renters and making renting a really long-term, viable, sustainable way of living. So it's not that kind of really precarious, you're renting and then 6 months your rent goes up, and that horrible cycle, which for people, who aren't going to be able to afford mortgages, that shouldn't in any way eliminate you from secure long-term housing. I think from that kind of radical reshaping and thinking of cities, which is still something that's kind of, I mean, I sort of even find it challenging, is I think sort of almost rapid densification is going to happen. Melbourne Uni just released a report called Project 30,000, and basically it's sort of looking at the fact that currently in Melbourne there are 170,000 people who need sort of housing urgently, which is probably why sort of the visibility of homelessness is becoming so much more apparent. And the report identifies that we can accommodate 30,000 more housing units quite quickly, but it's about sort of rethinking space and place. So we're moving into the government policy is value capture, value creation. We also sort of call it air rights. So it's looking at what we can sort of build on top of existing buildings and facilities. So I think a lot of people are really against densification, and I think it sort of poses so many issues around sort of, you know, cultural perspectives, tangible and intangible Aboriginal cultural heritage. But yeah, sort of the way we're thinking about cities is moving so quickly. I mean, we're even thinking about sort of looking at open space on top of buildings. So there's not going to be enough room for parks when we're trying to house all these people. So it will become more and more common for that sort of rooftop garden not to be what we think of a rooftop garden, but actual parks. And yeah, I mean, I sort of find it feels really sci-fi. I mean, I can't think of any way else to describe it, but this is just the sort of government standard strategy and policy. And when you sort of look at the Project 30,000, the way Melbourne Uni has kind of suggesting we house the 30,000 most vulnerable people, which is what we want to do. But it's quite astonishing sort of at work when we've sort of been analysing their data and the suggestions of where and how they want to find the space to create 30,000 more units of housing. It really does make you think of Blade Runner and all those kind of, that, you know, like when we think of those really crazy cities where sort of everything's sort of built on top of each other. And I think it's kind of happening, which is why, you kind of have to sort of almost rethink expectations. I mean, the Quarter-Acre block, I feel like people barely even talk about, you know, being nostalgic about that, because that just almost feels like, that's 20 years ago now to even be worried about having a decent-sized garden and house. You know, it's going to be people sort of living almost in nooks and crannies, the way it's kind of going. And I don't know, sort of trying to be positive about that and sort of thinking about, how to approach it in a way that is and can be people-centred.
Yeah, it's funny to think of like having a backyard, having a courtyard. These are things that, you know, it's like to have a courtyard is a huge benefit in the inner city, let alone a backyard, let alone parks that are really easily accessible. And these are issues that I think we're all facing, sort of living where we are. And just the notion of, I think about, you know, you think of the most expensive cities in the world, and for a long time New York was held up as this hugely expensive city. But then San Francisco, you can't build up in San Francisco because of all of the zoning laws. So it is, you know, completely exponentially gotten more expensive than New York, which, I don't know, to me seems like hard to even fathom. But the changing nature of that city in the last 10 years is just astounding. And so the idea of Melbourne, you know, those rights to the sky, it is really sci-fi, and it does kind of, you know, you immediately think of Blade Runner and things like that. It's kind of scary and exciting almost in a way that, is.
I think it's going to require like a huge cultural shift.
Absolutely.
I think like one of the things that I was thinking of when you said what can people do in their own communities, I think vote in socialists into local government because I feel like most of the other, you know, local governments are beholden to developers, and if you let developers determine how densification is going to happen, that is a real problem, I think, because they're only interested in profit, and what we really need is planners and people like architects and designers to have, and citizens to have input into that process for, like Timmah said, for it to be people-centred and for it to, you know, for these spaces not just to be dense but to offer some kind of quality of life, you know. Yeah.
I mean, one of the interesting things, we can look forwards, but we can also look backwards, because King's Cross was actually one of the most dense urban neighbourhoods in the world for a period of time, and it was a housing model that was based around big old mansions that had been retrofitted or just recreated and imagined into these boarding houses, which were homes for single people or small families or groups of people or whatever. They were just kind of carved up and recreated, and it was extremely high density living. And what came with that is not that sort of idea or that nightmare of alienation, but was a real vibrant street life, which was based around restaurants that were open like all the time, and cafes and coffee shops and little bars and nightlife and clubs, and obviously gangsters and corruption and violence and all that stuff, but not trying to paint rose-coloured glasses or whatever. But I think there is a model in that which was from 40 years ago, where you can have high density living in the city that isn't alienating in the way that we think about it when developers determine what happens with high density living, and it's based around a sort of profit margin rather than sort of that bottom up community creation.
Yeah, and that really goes back to what you were talking about before, Jessie, about the notion of when people actually renovate or when people change spaces as opposed to developers going in and changing those spaces. So actually it's the owner of the building who decides, I want to put an extra apartment in here, and that's what's making things more interesting, and that's what's kind of really developing the community as well as the building. Well, I think we've got quite a little while for questions from the audience. I'd be keen to open it up. We can of course go back if I've got more questions, but how about we take this opportunity to open it to everyone here? Any questions?
Thank you so much for the discussion. I've recently, I guess in talking in this topic about moving cities and changing environments, and I'm thinking about cities evolving, and I know the discussion has been very much about development and I guess even population growth, things like that. I've recently come back from a trip to Europe, and one of the observations I made of the major cities of, say, Rome or Paris or really beautiful places is the impact of tourism and how that impacts on the city and the way that it evolves to adapt to the flow of people while not permanent, the impact that it does have on the city. And I suppose it's a comment or sharing an observation, and I'm keen to hear any thoughts that any of you have around the impact of tourism on the city and the way that I guess changes almost the heart and soul of the city, possibly. Any thoughts on that?
Well, King's Cross is a big example of that, where a lot of the boarding houses that have been emptied out of that community that, due to the fight that was sort of lost in the 70s, are now backpackers and have been really shifted towards tourism. I think tourism has a sort of contradictory effect, because in some ways it can preserve heritage buildings because they are actually a tourist attraction, but obviously it falls into some of the stuff I was saying earlier about consumptive methods of interacting with spaces. So tourists are often kind of choose to or railroaded into sort of experiences which are very commodified, the tour or the t-shirt or you buy something as a way of sort of interacting with a space, and I guess that chimes in with that sort of whole problem of what's happening to our city spaces. But yeah.
To be honest, I don't really notice tourists in Melbourne that much. I feel like tourism in Melbourne is quite different because we don't have big attractions, and so tourists are more feel like more part of the flow of the city, and it's more about consumption, really. They do come here to shop and to go to the restaurants and the laneways and all that kind of thing. I mean, I know there are a lot of tourist operators in Melbourne, but it doesn't feel invasive or like that. I don't know. I'm never that aware of it, but it is an interesting question, because there was a recent someone posted on Facebook about one of the big magazines did a survey of tourists, and Melbourne came out in the top, number 3 of destinations, and people were sort of blown away by that. And the reasons that were cited, or the things that were cited as like why Melbourne's such a great city, was basically its arts culture. And I just find that fascinating because it's so not valued in Melbourne, you know, like by locals or like by the government or by, you know, the politics of the day. But yeah, so it's just that it is a different kind of tourism. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept because when I think of King's Cross and St Kilda, areas where there's lots of backpackers, those backpackers are also boarding houses for people who are on really low incomes. And so it's this interesting kind of dynamic between like you encourage tourism so you have cheap accommodation, but that actually in itself supports people that, you know, need emergency accommodation in a kind of roundabout sort of way. And so when we're kind of, you know, I'm thinking very much about boarding houses and backpackers that have closed down, that actually they cut out tourism, or at least they cut out student tourism or youth tourism, and they cut out, you know, emergency accommodation for homelessness, just to bring in that kind of that particular type of tourist, you know, who can afford the fancy Airbnb or who can afford the, you know, boutique hotel that might only have 5 actual rooms in it. So it's a really interesting notion thinking about gentrification and tourism and what sort of tourists do we want in the city, or what sort of tourists do local governments and governments want in the city, you know, and encouraging that sort of, you know, the right kind of tourist as opposed to the backpackers and the students and the singles and the people who are just trying to explore and, you know, find themselves or whatever. So it's a really kind of interesting dynamic there.
That's such a good point, yeah.
I mean, you can sort of peel off different layers of gentrification too. This King's Cross is another example of gentrification of sex work, which, you know, has a big history in King's Cross, and it was definitely focused around the brothels and the strip clubs. I mean, the brothels were technically illegal; they were massage parlours or whatever, but that was the sort of mode of business. Part of the struggle, possibly, you know, around the development was that business model kind of dying a little bit, and certainly with the advent of the internet, now it's really dead. But I mean, sort of before that, what happened was that actually it turned out that the kind of customer for the brothel would prefer. It was sort of more low-key and easier to kind of go in the suburbs, just kind of where they lived or worked. So you get the sort of growth of the sort of suburban brothels and they kind of were starting to die out from King's Cross. And then, you know, online dating and online pornography and, you know, the whole sort of transformation of the industry really kind of accelerated that process. And so those clubs really died out in King's Cross. But it's funny now because how things loop and around, because now you've got the actual brothels coming back into King's Cross because it's almost like gotten suburban enough for that sort of process to have taken a full loop. But yeah, I think you can, when you take an issue like gentrification, we often just think about it as that inner city housing and, you know, some of the traditional sort of discussions around artists and that sort of stuff. But you can go real deep and it affects all sorts of different aspects like tourism and sex work and, you know, all sorts of other parts of the city that perhaps we don't think about so often.
Yeah, that's a really important point because when you think about, you know, there's a fantastic, you know, the Women's House in St Kilda, run by St Kilda Sacred Heart Mission. That's an amazing resource for working women, but also just for, you know, women who are experiencing domestic violence or, you know, trouble at home for any reason. And suddenly it's like, how are these women getting there? Because there's no, you know, it's hard to get to if you've got low income and you can't exactly afford, you know, the cab or the train fare to get there. But all of a sudden you've been kicked out of that area. So suddenly we've got these amazing resources that communities of people that would really use them can't actually resource them. You know, we have soup vans in the cities that go to areas because people know that that's where they can get a free meal, and yet there's no emergency housing anymore in the city. So, like, you know, what that resource is actually, what's, you know, it's being under-resourced or underutilised, and it's such a bigger issue, you're right, Zanny, and it's really interesting to kind of pull apart those layers and think about, well, it's not just about the artists, it's not just about the tourists, but it's about all these other kind of micro communities. Any other questions?
I've got a question, actually.
Yes, please.
If I may. I guess also keeping in mind the environmental impacts, is there a point where we'll know when we've gone too far, or maybe we have, and will we be able to, do you think we have the capability to reverse it, or who will those decision makers be to maybe bring those communities back? Are we capable of a society to do that?
That's a massive.
too big a ask.
I don't think we
In some ways,
currently
it feels like we have already gone too far. Like the second colonisation happened, you could argue that that was the start of everything changing. And even when you think, I mean, it's interesting, which kind of connects to kind of how you maybe soothe or protect a city, and looking at that kind of, which connects a little bit more to climate change, but in terms of what we can do to cities, and that sort of thinking about this interest, which I almost feel like it's retrofitting and wanting to introduce Indigenous knowledge. And yeah, you just sort of think, if only we'd kind of listened to traditional owners of this country, of sort of where we should have built buildings, kept Elizabeth Street as a river, all this kind of way we kind of could have worked around the city. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's so interesting. I think because things tend to be happening so rapidly, and I'm sort of even looking, I think, with the election coming up, they're wanting to do this task force around population growth, because there is this awareness that the population is just growing so rapidly that it's not about like communities being pushed out and having to bring them back in. It's this sort of sense of, where is anyone going to live? Because to a certain extent, we're all going to, and I guess this is just coming from a Melbourne perspective, the rapid rate of population growth and even sort of global displacement, not that we're kind of at the sort of stage of welcoming refugees at the rate we could be, but I think it's more kind of like, yeah, sort of not sort of thinking yourself as being displaced, but kind of having that sort of, yeah, almost kind of adaptability to sort of embrace or create communities in new situations, as opposed to kind of thinking whether we can, you know, re-gentrify or bring back people who were pushed out of their neighbourhood. Because I think more and more it's kind of like, I don't know, it's more about just building and supporting all of those newer urban fringe, the sort of Pakenham, Cranbourne, Melton, Wyndham communities. It's like putting all our energy to the sort of urban growth boundary of Melbourne, and sort of making sure that we're not going to have this extreme geographical disadvantage where inner and middle Melbourne prospers and fine, and then you've got the urban growth fringe, which is just like this ghetto of McDonald's and then paddocks and a house, and, you know, and because transport's just completely not working, you're just kind of locked out there. And just, you think of the impact of young people growing up in those areas. So yeah, sometimes I think it's almost just like completely flipping the way we look at it and just really prioritising new suburbs, which are just happening. Like, I'm always shocked when people list all these new suburbs that you've never heard of, and you're like,
and quite often those suburbs come up so quickly. Yeah. And so, as you say, you have these almost Lego block pieces of, you know, a shopping centre and, you know, a McDonald's and a this and a that. And suddenly you've got this homogenised kind of urban sprawl that is sort of unnoticed, and then suddenly, you know, you're driving an extra hour to get out of Melbourne, or an extra 2 hours, or whatever it is.
That can also, like, those speculative developments can fail. And if you look into the history of, like, the city of Moreland, for example, there was many waves of speculative development. So there were waves of developers sort of like wanting to build little miniature, you know, Caroline Springs, essentially, in Brunswick and Coburg, and, you know, they'd fail. You know, they wouldn't thrive. Not enough people would come, you know, they couldn't actually get traction to be a community, and Wheel and the Wreckers would come and demolish them all. You know, and I wonder, that was my kind of question about the kind of multi-dwellings that are going up in the area now, which I see as so kind of the ultimate, you know, environmental blemish, because they're so poorly built, they're so wasteful, they're so badly insulated, they're so, you know, resource intensive, and they're not going to last 20 years, you know, like they're barely lasting 5 years in some cases. They will all have to be demolished at some point, and something else will have to be built there. Yeah.
I mean, that's the tragedy of it. Like Green Square in Sydney is a big new suburb. I mean, it's Chippendale, Green Square. A lot of those inner city suburbs are like tripling in the numbers of people who are living there. But like Green Square, all the new apartments they're building, well, not all, but they're like 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom, and they're kind of built for making money now, but they're not built long term for families or communities to live in. So they will have a really short use by date. Yeah. And when you think about what we're doing to our planet, that sort of, you know, that waste is really quite horrific, you know. So I guess what we'll be doing in the future is retrofitting all those buildings to try and make them more livable and more ecological and more expansive and flexible to communities. But that'll be a big headache that we'll have to deal with, I guess, down the track.
That's why I say vote for socialists, because like I'm not even a socialist, but I feel like they're the only ones who have any kind of conceptual tools to deal with these things.
The hard thing is also resources too, because I mean, I used to live in Fairfield, and our street was just the big walk-ups, like all the, you know, and they were all falling apart. They're obviously built in the 70s, or, you know, they'd sort of spent their time, and they're sort of yellow bricks or whatever. And I used to walk past and just dream about what you could do to them. And, you know, there was amazing stuff, like, you know, big roofs you could turn into like green areas and solar panels, and, you know, but the thing is they're all individually owned mostly and fragmented, and no one has that kind of infrastructural money, and that's the really frustrating thing, because the developers have that in spades, you know, and that's I guess why we always end up, you know, having to be reactive to their kind of agenda, because you know, they're the ones who can sort of lay out a vision. But you know, the green bands was this amazing moment where there was an alternative vision. And I guess that's what, in terms of what we do now, and some of the stuff that what you were talking about, is trying to create those alternative visions and find the ways to resource them, and find the communities to kind of agitate for them, and try and help just, you know, in the gaps and cracks, make a different city that can sort of be an alternative pole to the city we have that's growing now, I guess. Yeah.
I've got an 80% formulated question that follows up from that, which is about, I guess, what Zanny was saying about non-commodified spaces and interactions, and the idea of communities that can move. I mean, what is the role of the built environment in community building, and beyond parks and libraries? What are the kinds of things that we should be incorporating into our visions? I guess also it ties into the idea of social movements being collective versus the individualism of Courtney Barnett talking about her desire to not be in Preston. You know, bringing together versus the individual voice complaining about their lot. How does that interact with this idea of these tools and resources for non-commodified spaces?
There's a quote from Jane Jacob, who you mentioned earlier, where something like old buildings can produce new ideas, but new buildings never produce new ideas, or something like that. But I think what she was trying to get at was that like those big old industrial factories and the sort of old industrial kind of architecture was designed for a purpose that faded out or whatever, and then those spaces could be quite flexibly readapted into all sorts of things, like the warehouses and the studios and now the big cultural centres or whatever. And there's something about that those old buildings that have sort of allowed the next generation to kind of dream about what they want to do with that space. Whereas the problem with the kind of these really profit-driven developments is that the new buildings is that, as I said earlier, they're very foreclosed, and so I think effectively we will have to dream in those buildings. We will have to think of ways, because it's probably too wasteful to pull them down. You know, we are going to have to really put our thinking caps on and use our imagination. And, you know, living in Western Sydney for a period of time, you see a lot of that kind of creative imagination in suburbia where people are really making spaces that have been really designed very poorly and, just with sheer quick profit in mind. So it does happen. So Jane probably wasn't 100% right, but I think there is that kind of natural, connection we have to an open space, a space that could be reimagined different ways. That's so much harder to do in a space that's closed off and been sort of really boxed into a certain use. And I guess that's the conundrum of what's happening to our cities, that we have to kind of overcome that or find ways to...
Do you feel like it has to have good enough bones? Like, I mean, I just purely for the fact that, I think people can adapt to anything, and you're right, they probably will have to adapt to, badly built, buildings. But yeah, it does concern me that that they just won't last long enough for people to have to adapt. That they won't be capable of taking on, and being flexible.
Well, and also what new buildings do to the buildings around them. When new buildings go up, quite often they involve, underground car parks. So therefore you suddenly need a retaining wall and digging. And so suddenly you've not only taken away a building that was there, but you're actually influencing the buildings around because there's new structural issues that weren't there before because of the new buildings. So it's this kind of really interesting sort of complex notion of what is actually the impact of new developments. You hear stories about young people purchasing these apartments off the plan and being really excited and then waiting years for them to be built and then never moving in because they get there and they're so badly built that they sell them immediately. And that's devastating for many new first home buyers who get so excited and have spent so much time waiting and then only to find their apartments unlivable.
There was that, community that occupied, where was it? The skyscraper that was sort of half built, ended up being a mass squat. People are endlessly creative in terms of, and we may have to be with some of these kind of crappy buildings. So,
and then there was also that big fire and that big artist squat was it in Portland? I can't remember exactly where it was in America, but there's basic health and safety issues that come into it as well. An ex-student of mine was one of the group of artists who had access to a food court in Docklands. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that art space, and that was always really interesting to me because it was part of that Renew Docklands movement of giving artists access to these buildings like that were abject commercial failures, and hoping that somehow they'd reinstate value. And they did so many things in those spaces, but they were really, really difficult spaces to work against what they were designed for. They were really overwhelming. Those the way that those spaces were built.
It's a huge challenge. I think, the Docklands is definitely a place where you just think it's crying out for all sorts of adaptive reuse, but the challenge is that it's so poorly built and designed. But I don't know, there are slow innovations, and it's not necessarily connected to the really shoddy, cheap builds, those sort of apartments that are going up in Docklands, Brunswick, that, you do sort of imagine you would be so disappointed if you moved into. But from a planning perspective, they just launched Commercial 3 Zone, and the focus of that is to kind of retransform industrial buildings, focusing on areas like Brunswick and Collingwood, Richmond, and sort of protect them from that sort of more commercial and residential development, and transition them appropriately using the right OH&S so that they become more sort of like co-working spaces, artist studios, and also include a certain proportion of residential dwelling. So I think things like that, if there's more ways to sort of reconceptualise, because we know that sort of that heavy industrial manufacturing is more of a dying trade, but we have all these areas that have an abundance of buildings. And I think things like that can help you to sort of rethink the city. And I think, it's just inevitable that if you've got all this issue with housing and then you've got all these shoddy built developments going everywhere and people, they're not being sold, then whether there will be some massive government forcibly acquires them and turns them into emergency. Yeah, they could easily become emergency public housing in another 20, 30 years, easily.
So there's hope.
I mean, again, you don't want to put the most disadvantaged people in the crappiest designed buildings, but yeah, maybe emergency temporary accommodation could be, But certainly I think the way we're sort of really looking at industrial areas and, you know, in light of the horrible fire in Footscray, you really have to kind of think, okay, there's all these buildings that aren't being used for the way they were purposely designed. So how do we kind of readapt and kind of think about how they can become homes for artists and creative startups and include some residential dwellings within that kind of those precincts. Is, I guess, one positive aspect to the rapid and sometimes horrible way it feels that cities are growing.
I think Jessie's right what she was saying before though about corruption, because there is really because I mean you've probably come across this, but urban planning is so big and complicated. It's often people don't hold it all in their heads, and so it's not really part of the conversation often about elections. We think more about other kind of issues, so it sort of just slides along. And there's been so many scandals where it's just been so demonstrably proven that developers are just completely in pockets with both the major parties, and they're kind of non-solutions that they're kind of rolling out in all the cities in Australia and elsewhere, of course, as well. But so I think we do need to actually care about these issues and put them back into the conversation about things like diversity or climate change, and all those things come back to how we live as well, like how resources are managed and cities are managed. And so taking care over these issues and situating them in a sort of political conversation.
I have a lot of hope for the future because I teach, and so many of my students, I feel like there's been this real resurgence in interest in the union movement, in interest in these kind of issues. People who are younger than us are dealing with much harsher realities than we had to, and I feel like they're really engaged, and it's inspiring. So I feel like it's not all bleak. It's not at all.
Well, on that note, I would ask that everybody thanks the panellists. It's been such a pleasure to have you all here this evening, and it's been a really interesting conversation, so thank you so much for coming in.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Chelsey, Zanny, Jessie and Timmah for tonight. It was a wonderful conversation. Oh, yes.
Just also, we have Jessie's book in the shop, which is actually open this evening. We also have Zanny's Beehive jacket in the shop, which is also open this evening. So if you want to check it out on your way out, you can. And both are very hard to find elsewhere, so I would encourage you to check them out here.
I'm going to add on to that another ACMI plug for our conversation next week on Chinese Australian representation on screen. It's going to be a cracker as well, so we hope you come along to that one. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you.